atheist questions answered, which there's so many questions that are kind of thrown at Christianity or thrown at the idea of believing in God, as to why God can't exist, or why Christianity must be wrong. And we went through loads of those, and there are so many that actually I thought, well, let's go through some more, because God's got the answers, or that's what we would say. God has the answers. So let's keep giving the answers. If we find out that there is an answer to, if you like, every accusation that's thrown at Christianity, then that suggests that Christianity is valid, and certainly then we should act on what it says. Now, I've got a whole range of questions. We'll get going and see how we do. If I see people slowly logging out, I'll know it's time to stop, and we'll quickly get on with the final hymn. These questions, by the way, they're not, I haven't picked them and gone, oh, that'll be easy to answer, or that'll be easy to answer. They are ones that, if you watch various questions on YouTube or various forums, they're ones that to me seem to come up a lot, and they're in no particular order. So I haven't kind of hand-picked these to try and make it easier for myself. So here's the first one, and it is this. It is the claim that religion is just an emotional crutch. In other words, religion is just something that you feel you need because emotionally maybe you're not that strong. It's not actually real, but it just kind of makes you feel better. Now, that's interesting. A lot of that, and something I've actually had someone said to me, is based on this idea that this quote by this man, religion is the opium of the masses. Now, this is Karl Marx. The man in the picture is Karl Marx. That's the kind of beard I'm aiming for one day, I hope. It looks like he's lost his mobile phone. You know, when you kind of think, where's my mobile? So Karl Marx in 1867 wrote a book called Das Kapital, which was basically about politics and society and economies. And he became very famous for this because it's the basis of the political ideology communism. So he basically invented communism. It's made him world famous. And one of the things he said was that religion is the opium of the masses. It's basically something you just rely on. It's not actually real, but you just kind of feel like you need it. Okay, so let's look at this quote first. Interestingly, I would wonder, if anyone ever says this to you, I would wonder why people revere Karl Marx as a great thinker. I watched a program once and it had Jeremy Paxman on it, you know, the well-known TV, BBC presenter, journalist and things. And he was complaining about this. He says, Karl Marx invented a political theory in communism that has never ever worked anywhere it's been tried. He says, so why do people revere him? And it's quite a good point. I could come up with a political theory that doesn't work. I mean, it's easy, you know, and would people revere me? Would they hang on my every word? And the other interesting thing is that people, if they ever say to you, well, you know what Karl Marx said? He said, religion is the opium of the masses. You say, well, are you a communist? And of course, the vast majority of people would say, well, no, I'm not. So why do you reject 99.99% of what Karl Marx wrote, but you accept this one sentence? It's strange, that, isn't it? So I think one of the things, and this applies to all the questions we're going to look at tonight, something that is really important right at the start is that an argument is valid according to the pros and cons of that argument, not according to who said it. So just because someone who is famous, for example, says something, doesn't mean that it's right. You have to look at the argument. So, hey, here's a famous guy who you might recognize, right? Now, there's no doubting this guy is incredibly famous and the most powerful man in the world. He said this. He said that you could inject bleach to cure coronavirus. Do you believe him because he's famous? Well, no, because you weigh up the argument and you say, absolutely not. And can I just stress, I felt like as a health and safety warning, I had to put that in. Don't do this, right? Don't do it. But you see what I mean? You've got a famous person who has said something and you reject it because the argument makes no sense. And I think that's true in a lot of these questions. It's not about who asked the question. We have to get beyond that and work out whether the argument is valid or not. Anyway, back to this thing. Religion is just an emotional crutch. Is that all it is? Okay, can Christianity, in our case, can it soften our emotional pain when we're going through difficult times? Yes, absolutely it can. When we're going through difficult times, it can absolutely help us emotionally. And thanks for pointing it out, because it's one of the greatest benefits of our faith. An example would be, and it's a verse we looked at earlier this afternoon, for example, here we go, Deuteronomy 31 verse 8, the Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. And I think that most of the people within the ecclesia, maybe all the people within the ecclesia and most ecclesias would say, absolutely. Christianity, our faith, our belief, our discipleship has helped us emotionally and helped us in difficult times. But that doesn't mean it's the reason we believe. It's a benefit of why we believe, but not the reason we believe. So we believe in God and in his son, Jesus Christ, and for a whole range of reasons. Now, and most of these ones I put here are actually quite objective reasons. They're not emotional ones. So, for example, prophecies that have already come true. Prophecies that were made thousands of years ago and have come true. Archaeology that prove what the Bible, what it says in the Bible did actually happen. Scriptural accuracy over millennia. In other words, thousands of years ago, and over the space of about 1,500 years, maybe a bit more, the Bible was written. And it all ties together perfectly, despite being written by so many different authors. Now, that's a very strong argument for me personally. The logic of the gospel message. Actually, when you go through it, logically, it makes a lot of sense. The survival of the Jews, of the Israelite nation, is again another very strong argument. How have they managed to survive, considering all the persecution that they've had, again, over a couple of thousand years or more? Science increasingly, despite what people may tell you, backs up the Bible message. And there's some very, very sound philosophical reasons. There's a real renaissance, apparently, in Western philosophy of philosophers saying, we've worked out that God must exist. Now, these aren't emotional reasons. These are much more objective reasons. There may be others that you can think of that I've forgotten about. So we believe, and a lot of our belief is based on objective reasons. The emotional crutch, if you like, the emotional support comes with that, but it's not in place of it. And I think that's really important. Okay, next question. I hear this one a lot, ever such a lot, actually. If God is so loving, why doesn't he accept everyone? If God is so loving, why doesn't he accept everyone? I think we can split this into two parts. First off, is God loving? And then secondly, why doesn't he accept everyone? Let me throw a little analogy your way, a little story. It's not very deep. You'll see through it straight away, okay? But I'm going to say it anyway. So, imagine there was a billionaire in the town, and the billionaire told every single person in the town, I'm going to give you each £1 million. Every single one of you, I'm going to give you £1 million. I want you to use it to do good things. And if you do good things with it, then a little bit down the line, a few years down the line, I'll give you another 10 million. You can have $1 million now, and if you do good things, I'll give you another 10 million. If you don't do good things, you can still have the 1 million. How's that? And some people did what the billionaire wanted and used the money as he wanted, and some didn't. They just used the money for living. Others used the money to do the opposite of what the billionaire wanted. And others actually used the money he gave them to campaign against him and say he was a fraud. And the billionaire knew that this would happen. And he said, I will still give each of you £1 million anyway. I want to give you the opportunity to get the further 10 million. Now, a few years later, the billionaire came back and he came to hand out the extra 10 million to everyone who'd done what he wanted. And the people who hadn't done what he wanted complained because they didn't get the extra money. And they said that showed he wasn't loving. Now, do you think the billionaire was loving? I would say he was. Surely he was. He gave people the money in the first place, which he didn't have to do. He was loving by rewarding those who followed his instructions. He was loving by giving the £1 million to people who he knew would misuse it, but he gave it to them anyway. He gave them the opportunity to do what he wanted. And he also laid out clear guidelines. He said, you can have the $1 million. If you do this, you get nothing else. But if you do this, you'll get a reward. Now, I'm sure you've seen through this, and obviously the billionaire would relate to God. Is God loving? Well, God has given us all a life, and he's told us how he'd like us to use it. And let's not forget, we so often take life for granted. Life is a gift from God. You know, we are alive because we have the breath of God inside us. God has given everyone a life, and he's told us how to use it. And he said, if you use it like this, you'll get a reward. If you don't use it, you won't get a reward, but you can still have your life. You can't then go back to God and say, I didn't use my life the way you wanted me to, but I still want the reward. And if you don't give it me, it shows you're not loving, because God said, I didn't have to give you your life in the first place. I was loving enough to do that. So I think if God doesn't give us the reward, it doesn't mean that he isn't loving. It means that we haven't loved him. God has been loving in the first place by giving us life at all. And you see, it's very often forgotten. And when you hear these debates, it's amazing how many people will throw these accusations at God without actually with knowing very, very little about God at all. And it's often forgotten that God's reward and his continuing love is conditional. He makes that very clear. He doesn't hide it. He says, if you want my continuing love, if you want my reward, there are conditions. Jesus made that clear too. For example, John 15, verse 14, Jesus said, you are my friends if you do what I command. Therefore, if you don't do what I command, you're not my friends. Now, that might sound harsh, but they're not hiding anything. They're not hiding anything away. It is conditional. Now, another important point. Does being loving mean that you accept everyone? That's an interesting thing, because the claim that's made is, well, if God's loving, shouldn't he accept everyone? I think that saying that being loving means you accept everyone is a completely false statement. Now, I'm going to show you some extreme examples, shall we say. Okay, so not your average Sunday evening slide, but you look at the people here. So you've got some members of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, the kind of extreme neo-fascist, racist Nazi organization. Chairman Mao there, who killed 60 million of his own people. Hitler, who seems to be the embodiment, of evil. We know many of the atrocities he committed. Stalin, who killed 20 million of his own people. Now, obviously, these are extreme examples. We always start with hyperbole. We start with extreme examples. Okay. Now, many of you people at Lapworth and further beyond at other ecclesias, you are amongst the most loving people I know. And I'm not just saying that to win you over. I am actually just saying that to win you over. But no, genuinely, you are very, very loving people. Would you accept these people? Would you accept their morals and their values and their standards? Would you let them in your house? Absolutely not. You wouldn't accept them, and I wouldn't accept them either. I do not accept their morals and their standards and their values. I know these are extreme examples, but you could lower it and lower it. And if you, for example, knew that someone was extremely violent, would you let them in your house? If you knew someone had extreme views, would you accept their views? No. No, you wouldn't. Does that mean you're not loving? doesn't mean you're not loving if you don't accept their views. Ironically, I can think of a number of people who say they're loving and accepting of everyone. I'm thinking of some people now who have said that, and actually some of them are the same people who say, and if God is loving, he should accept everyone. And yet they absolutely hate Boris Johnson, and they abhor Donald Trump, and they don't like anyone who voted for Brexit, and they hate the Conservative Party and the Daily Mail reader and the Daily Tele, etc., etc. Now, I'm not saying that Johnson or Brexit or the Daily Mail are right or wrong any more than the Mirror and the Guardian and Keir Starmer and whoever else. But the point is, they, for example, would not accept some of those values and standards, but they would say they're loving. And I think that's an interesting question. If someone says, if God is so loving, why doesn't he accept everyone? An interesting reply is, are you loving? And people tend to say, yes, I am. Do you accept anyone? Now, that's interesting, because if they say no, then obviously you can't throw the same accusation at God. If they say yes, well, think of some of the people they would have to accept. Being loving does not mean that you accept anyone at all, whatever they are like. That is not being loving. In fact, I think the opposite is true. I would suggest this. Being loving means that you have values and morals that are important to you, that may be based around love, but you have standards, shall we say. And then being loving means that you protect those you love in order to keep them safe. And that's really important. If you are loving, you protect those you love in order to keep them safe. As a parents are loving to their children, so you protect them in order to keep them safe. Therefore, God is loving, because that's a description of God. And he loves us, and he wants to protect us, and he wants to keep us safe. Right, let's fly on to another one. Yes, I've been asked this. I was asked it by someone at the university. Why does God do things that are wrong? And of course, I put wrong in inverted commas there. Maybe it follows on from the previous question. Very often it's linked to values in society today that don't align with values in the Bible. Not always, but often. Okay, why does God do things that are wrong? Okay, a couple of things. Here we go. If you do believe in God, then you know that God doesn't do anything wrong, as he's the arbiter, or if you like, he's the judge of what is right and wrong. So God doesn't do anything wrong because the way he acts defines what is right and what is wrong. So if you believe in God, there's not a problem. We know what right and wrong is by looking at God. If you don't believe in God, then how do you know what is wrong? And I'm quite serious there. How do you actually know what is wrong, or for that matter, what is right? Now, that might seem a silly thing because we say, well, we know that murder is wrong, or it's wrong to do this or to do that. We know some things are wrong. Okay, how do you know that without God? Now, God says he's written this on our hearts. But if you, I think that's in Romans, but if you don't believe in God, you can't rely on that. Now, something we looked at a year ago, but I've just dropped this slide in again. This is very interesting. This is from, it's a widely held view within philosophical circles, and it's from a website called allaboutphilosophy.org. It's not a Christian website, it's just a philosophy website, and it's about the philosopher Bertrand Russell. Now, Bertrand Russell was one of the great figures of modern philosophy, probably in the top 3 figures of modern philosophy. So very widely respected, and an atheist. Although, interestingly, he had some very nice things to say about Christadelphians. But he was an atheist. Okay, so from allaboutphilosophy.org, they said, atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell declared, and philosophers generally agree, without God, there is no absolute truth, and thus no universal moral standard of conduct. The exclusion of God necessitates moral relativism. Okay, let's explain that. So what Bertrand Russell argued, and which most philosophers would argue, is when you have God, you know what is right and wrong, because God says that's right and that's wrong, that's right and that's wrong, and so on and so forth. But if you take this kind of objective view of what is right and wrong out, if you take God out of the equation, what do you refer back to as the objective standard of right and wrong? You don't have an objective standard. So therefore, there is no what they call universal moral standard of conduct. That means that you descend into a thing called moral relativism. What's moral relativism? Moral relativism is the view that moral or ethical statements, which vary from person to person, are all equally valid, and no one's opinion of right and wrong is really better than any other. This results in the biggest practical problem for relativism. It is difficult, if not impossible, to condemn any actions from a stance of moral relativism. So, what is moral relativism? Without God, you descend into moral relativism, which is we have no definition of what right and wrong is. So if I say something's right, well, it is to me. And if you say it's wrong, it is to you. And we're both right because we've got nothing to refer back to. And it says, what does it say there? Remember, this is not a Christian website. It says, with moral relativism, which you get without God, it is difficult, if not impossible, to condemn any actions from that point of view. So if someone says this is wrong, say, how do you know it's wrong? Because if I don't think it is, it isn't. Tough. And that is what an atheist philosopher, one of the greats of modern philosophy, is saying. If you take God out, there is no right or wrong. Sorry. So that's quite interesting. Without God, there is no definitive right or wrong, only what each individual thinks. So this actually takes us back to the previous slide. If someone says, why does God do things that are wrong? You say, well, if you believe in God, he doesn't, because God defines what's right or wrong. And if you don't believe in God, then there isn't any wrong. It's just up to each individual person. That's a problem. Much better, surely, to believe in God and have a set of moral standards. Okay, another one. And again, I hear this one quite a bit as well. Why doesn't God intervene to stop terrible things happening? Why doesn't God intervene to stop terrible things happening? I remember a lot of people saying it around the time of 9/11. For those who, it's strange, that isn't it? 19 years ago, 9/11. And I remember lots of people saying, well, why didn't God intervene? Why didn't Jesus come back and stop it, for example? Okay, why doesn't God intervene to stop terrible things happening? The first answer is maybe a little bit more frank than one might expect. And the first answer is, why should he? Why should he intervene? Let's just think about it for a moment. So we're in a society that's been moving away from God for years. And I think we could all agree, and I certainly notice this, the older I get, the more I realize how increasingly rapidly society is moving away from God. I mean, it's moving away from God at a rapid pace. People's morals and values are less and less godly. God is being removed from our schools. I mean, when I was a kid, every assembly pretty much was a Christian assembly. Very rare now, unless you're at a Christian school. Most people have stopped going to church. Society constantly mock God and Jesus, and it's painful the amount of times you see that on TV or on the radio, in films and things like that. They also mock the belief in God and Jesus. God and Jesus' names have become like a form of swear word. You know, they blaspheme. You know, it becomes like something you shout out instead of swearing. Society has decided that we don't need to follow God or Jesus anymore. And some people, of course, are trying to remove them completely from society. And then after all that, they say, God, can't you come and stop this terrible thing from happening? And to be frank, there's a part of me that says, well, why should he? You can't do all those things. If you're someone who ties in with all those things listed there, You can't do that and then say, well, why doesn't God come back and sort out the problems I've got? Doesn't make sense. Why should he? So that's one thing. Secondly, we have to understand God's overall plan for the world. It's massively important, this. And I think this goes well beyond this talk. This goes into almost any Bible study you do, or any big question, certainly, about God and Jesus and his plans and things like that. We have to try and see it within the bigger picture. It's massively important. God's non-intervention right now, as it's understood, is a part of that. Because, of course, if you go back thousands of years, God used to get involved a lot. And God would intervene a lot. And we see that particularly in the Old Testament, of course, God intervening to stop certain things happening or to save certain people. You know, you had big things happening like the parting of the Red Sea would be an obvious one. So God used to get involved a lot. And then it got to the point after Jesus where he said, okay, I've come back now. Well, I've tried to help you time and time and time again, and you still keep rejecting me. And you keep rejecting my prophets, and you've even rejected my son. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to get involved for a bit because I've tried enough. I'm not going to get involved for a bit. I'm going to leave you to sort it out for yourselves and see how you get on. And then in time, I'll bring my son back to intervene once and for all. And in many ways, we don't have time to look at it, but that's the parable of the tenants. If you want to look it up, Luke 20, verses 9 to 19. But also, God is waiting for a time because of this. And this is a lovely verse, 2 Peter 3, verse 9. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. So God is saying, I'm not going to intervene yet, because I still want some of you to come to repentance, to come to believe in me, and to commit your lives to me. And then finally, I would say, who says God doesn't intervene? He may not intervene in a kind of parting of the Red Sea or Battle of Jericho type way, but who said he doesn't intervene? I think my favourite verse in the Bible is Romans 8, verse 28. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. That is saying quite clearly that from time to time, if God thinks you are maybe going off track, not heading to the kingdom, if you love him, every now and again, he will make things work in your life to help you get back on track. So it says that he does intervene. He may not be making the walls of Jericho fall down, but he is intervening like that. And then also, on a personal level, I mean, there's all kinds of personal stories that people could tell you about times where they say, I'm sure God was at work there. And there's a story I'd love to tell you, but it would take about 15 minutes, so we're not going to do it. An example, a much quicker example, I gave a talk, I spoke at a youth weekend a few years back, and I was talking to a group of lads afterwards, and they were talking about baptism. And I said, well, how come you haven't been baptized? How come you haven't committed your lives yet? And they said, oh, we're waiting for the big sign, for the kind of miracle. And I said, well, very rarely happens like that. It's much more of a kind of logical decision in a way. Not everyone has the road to Damascus conversion. Some people are lucky enough to. They said, well, that's what we're waiting for. Anyway, at the end of the youth weekend, the five of them got in a car and drove off. And the car went off the road, rolled down the side of the embankment, finished up on its roof, and all five of them got out and were perfectly fine. And I saw them a bit later and I said, is that not the sign you wanted? Oh no, they said, we're waiting for something else. Now, I'm not saying that was God who kept them safe in that. I'm not saying it wasn't. But it could well have been. Who says God doesn't intervene to stop terrible things happening? And actually, finally, can you tell me what terrible things God has stopped happening? Because if you think about it, if something hasn't happened, how do you know it was going to? What if there was going to be a huge disaster and God stopped it? Well, you wouldn't know, would you? Because it didn't happen. So, in terms of why doesn't God intervene, stop terrible things happening? Actually, sometimes God does intervene, not in the way maybe he used to in the Old Testament, but he is certainly intervening on a personal level in our lives, and that's hugely important. Right, we'll fly on, see if we can get one or two more done. Oh, yes. I watched a video about this the other day, and it really wound me up. So, why would God instruct that entire nations be wiped out? You see this one a lot. And the sad thing about this is often used as a way of describing the God of the Old Testament as being different to the God of the New Testament. And he's not. He's the same person with the same characteristics. But the idea is that God wiped out entire nations. And the one that's nearly always referred to is the Canaanites. And the kind of the world's most famous atheist, Richard Dawkins, is very keen on this. And he says, look how terrible God must be that he wiped out all the Canaanites. He must be absolutely awful, therefore he can't possibly exist, etc., etc. And you do hear this a lot as a question of Christianity. Why did God destroy entire nations? Okay, well, look at the Canaanites, because that's the one that's used the most. Okay, so the Canaanites, what did the Canaanites do? In this forum, I can't tell you everything the Canaanites did, because many of the things they did were so despicable, actually. They did many evil and horrific things, and they did them over centuries and centuries and centuries. And one of the gods that they worshipped was the god Molech, who's that big metal figure there with his arms out, the kind of dark grey figure. Molech was one of the gods that they worshipped. To give you an idea of the kind of things they did, amongst other horrific things, they would sacrifice their children to Molech. Now, personally, I would struggle to find anything more horrific than that. And I'm not even going to tell you how they did it, because it's not appropriate. They were a horrible, horrible, evil people who did many evil things over many, many years. And God, of course, abhorred this. He hated it. And I'm sure that most of us surely would hate this kind of thing going on. God had been patient with them. He'd given them centuries to change their ways. And there's evidence that they knew about God, but still didn't change. So he instructed that the Canaanites should be destroyed. Why? Well, he makes it quite clear. Deuteronomy 9, verse 4. After the Lord your God has driven the Canaanites out before you, do not say to yourself, the Lord has brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. So he's saying that to the Israelites. No, it is on account of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. God said there are wicked, awful things going on, and I cannot abide it. God doesn't just destroy a nation on a whim. He's a God of justice, and he watched what had been happening and eventually could take no more. And he said, they are too wicked. I'm going to punish them. Now, interestingly, if we went to the previous question we were looking at, we've got a kind of contradiction here. Because the previous question, people were asking, why doesn't God intervene to stop terrible things happening? And then often the same people say, why would God instruct that entire nations be wiped out? Well, in question 4, God did intervene to stop terrible things happening. The terrible things the Canaanites were doing. You can't argue from both points of view. When he intervenes, people complain, and when he doesn't intervene, people complain. That doesn't really seem very fair on God. You can't argue against God from that point of view. He instructed an entire nation that would be wiped out, frankly, because what they were doing was despicable. And I think the vast, vast, vast majority of the world population would agree it is despicable and needed to be stopped. Right, we'll fit one more in very quickly. This one doesn't take too long, don't worry. Right, yes. If God knows everything we're going to do before we've done it, how can we have free will? Now, again, this is one that comes up quite a lot. The idea of free will is very, very important to people. So free will, if you're not sure, free will means that basically you are free to make whatever decision you want. And God isn't making you make a decision or forcing you to make a decision. It's up to you. And that matters to a lot of people. And again, it's quite interesting. I've watched a lot of videos online of Christians and atheists, say two speakers, debating the idea of free will. And the argument is that God doesn't allow us free will. And people say, we want to have free will. It should be up to us to decide what we want to do. Okay. If God knows everything we're going to do before we've done it, how can we have free will? Okay. It's interesting, the argument about free will, because it's actually, people say God doesn't let us have that. Free will is really important to God. In fact, free will is central to God's plan for the world. Massively important. And it's throughout the Bible. Have a look. These are just a few of many, many verses I could have picked. So, for example, Joshua 24, verse 15. So I took one from the Old Testament to show that it goes throughout the Bible. Joshua 24, verse 15. Joshua said to the nation of Israel, "But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve." So Joshua's saying, you choose whether you serve God or not. It's your choice. And if we go into the New Testament, Jesus said, anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. So again, Jesus was saying, it's your choice. And if we go a little bit past Jesus, if we go to James 1, verse 13 and 14, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. So throughout the Bible, we are told it is your choice whether you want to follow God or not. It's absolutely key to God's will. God wanted people who choose to love him. Love cannot be forced. It has to be a free choice. It has to be. Otherwise, it's not really love. So God certainly wants us to have free will. The fact that he knows what we're going to do does not stop that. God is timeless and is also omniscient, so he's kind of all-knowing. Now, he knows what we're going to choose, even though it's our free will. It's a little bit like an analogy. I saw a video a few years ago, and I managed to find it early. It's very bad quality on YouTube. And these people, what they did, now this is very low quality. I appreciate that. So you can't really see. What they did is they got a little white car there, and they painted the cross of St. George, like basically the England flag, on the bonnet, and they covered it in England flags. So it was very much, if you like, an English car covered in England flags. And they parked it in a rather dodgy area of Glasgow in Scotland. Right. What do you think happened now? Right. The people who walked past that car had free will. And yet, because of the knowledge that you have, I think you know what's going to happen to that car. I won't play you the video, but within 20 minutes, a group of lads came by and jumped on the car and kicked in the windscreen. I don't know if you can see that, smashed in the windows at the side as well. Because they didn't like England, I suppose. Now, they had free will, but you knew it was going to happen. And we could use all kinds of examples of that, where with the knowledge I have, I know that if someone has this choice or this choice, I know which one they'll choose. God is all-knowing. So he says, I'll let you choose. But because I'm all-knowing, I know what you're going to choose. It doesn't mean I've made you choose it, but it means I know what you will do. And also, because God is timeless, So he's in the future and the past and the present. He also knows that way. But it is our free choice, and God wants it to be our free choice. It's important that it is our free choice. Now, an interesting thing to do with this argument about free will is to say, what if we take God out of the equation? Because as I said, free will is very, very important to so many people. And they have this debate, this argument, well, if God exists, I don't have free will. And we've said, well, you do. Okay. What if you take God out of the equation? Now, I've read quite a bit about this, and I watched a little video the other day. I won't show you now because it's only about 11 or 12 minutes long. I'd strongly recommend it to you. So if at some point you want to look at that link, and I guess this talk will be on the website. Mind you, it's that bad. It might not be, I suppose. But if I'll put this link there, as you can see, and it's Stephen Hawking, who of course did not believe in God. And Stephen Hawking, one of the world's at the time world's leading physicists, he actually argued that without God, nobody has free will. Now, he was arguing it from an atheist point of view, but he said from a purely scientific atheist point of view, without God, nobody has free will. It's a thing called scientific determination. You are bound to do certain things. Now, I won't get into it because it's relatively complex, but actually it's mind-blowing. And there's a lot of scientists now who are saying, any of us have free will if you don't believe in God, because we are programmed to act in a certain way. And that's incredible. So when the person comes to you and says, look, why doesn't God give me free will? We've shown that God does give you free will. It's vitally important to him. But without God, you actually don't have free will. And the world's leading scientists are saying you don't have free will. And right at the end of this video, like I say, it's only, in fact, looking there, it's about 13 minutes long. There were some other scientists involved who were helping him, who were atheists. And one of them said this. He said, if life is completely predetermined based on science, then I'm not sure what the reason for everything we're doing is. That's so messed up. It's really messed up. Now, you've got an atheist there saying, basically, my life's completely messed up because I realize I don't have any free will. So we've completely flipped this one on its head, because we had people saying, God doesn't give us free will. We've shown that he does. And actually, without God, if you take God out of the equation and just follow science, then you don't have free will. That's amazing. Right. That'll do for now, I think. What's good is there's a few questions I didn't answer, which means I can do yet another talk called Even More Atheist Questions Answered, Part 9, or something like that. We haven't gone into it in great depth. Obviously, we can go into much greater depth, or we would love to do that in some ways. I could go into much greater depth about all of the questions. But hopefully you can see that for each of these questions, God has an answer. God has an answer to every question. It's about looking at the question, weighing it up, looking at the Bible, so taking all the facts and seeing what the answer is. And there is always an answer. And if all the questions can be answered, then it suggests that God is also right about all the other things he tells us about in the Bible, and the things he expects us to do, and the reward he has for us at the end of it. So now it's up to us, it's up to our free will to choose to follow him and to get that reward by his grace. Thank you very much.